Hello, and welcome to the session with Systems Innovation this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us on a sunny afternoon out there. I hope everyone's doing well. Hopefully you can see my screen now. If you can, someone give me a thumbs up that you can see my screen, okay? We'll see the touch screen. Fantastic, thank you, Joss. Let's just have a look here. Cool. Well, thank you all for joining. What a fantastic afternoon we're having, and it's great to be with you for the next hour or so, hour and a half we've got here, as we tackle the subject of exploring systems innovations for cities. This is a session which is hosted by the Systems Innovation Network, particularly the London Hub I've been working with for the past few months, and we're exploring the cities theme. My name is James Snellgrove. It's really nice to be here with you. I'm an innovation and growth specialist with Innovate UK Edge, and I've been sort of getting into systems thinking and systems theory and systems innovation the past year or so. I'm really delighted to have found an amazing network out there, which I'm sure many of you guys are a part of, an active part of, and yeah, fantastic to be with Joss on this call and a few others today to host this session. We just wanted to say a quick hello. So we've sort of done that, and Joss might want to do a wave or say hello, because I know you will know a lot of people on this call as well. We wanted to just say a few things. So this is the session hosted by the London Hub. We would love everyone to keep their videos on and introduce themselves and say hello via the chat as well. That'd be fantastic. We're not quite back to meeting in person in a lot of places yet, but yeah, the ability to do this online is also good. Yeah, please say hello. Please type any questions, comments into the chat as well. I'll be keeping an eye on that and moderating that as we go through. And we've got some really great speakers and some good sessions coming up. So as and when you have some questions, comments, please add those in, and we'll try and get through a few of those. We've got a Miro board up as well, so I think Joss might be able to put a link to that in the chat right now. And there's a little Miro board with a kind of landing page that we wanted to encourage people to share any examples, research, kind of interesting things you may have found around systems innovation and cities particularly, and encourage you to have a look at that. This is a session which is live streamed on YouTube, and there will be a recording available after the session as well. And then finally, access to the SI network. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of people on this call who already know what fantastic resources are out there from the Systems Innovation Network and platform, and encourage anyone else who's not familiar with that yet to go and check it out. There's so much great free resource and templates and guides on there that Joss and others have been putting together in the past few months. That yeah, really just a fantastic resource that I've had great pleasure in looking through and utilising in my work as well. So we wanted just to kind of start the session by just reflecting on what we're trying to do today and some of the outcomes we're looking at. So really this is about exploring together the value and relevance of systems innovation to city challenges, and that's partly my background as well, having worked here as I'm here in Bristol, having worked in Bristol and looked at how cities work and how we begin to understand the different kind of relationships within cities and the different ways in which cities work as a system. So we wanted to look at utilizing the principles, the theory, the methodologies behind systems thinking, systems innovation for cities. So we wanted to look at that. Wanted to make those ideas behind systems innovation, the ideas and methods, more accessible. And we've particularly invited people who are actively working with cities and responsible for managing parts of cities to the call today. So that's super exciting to have people, actively leading aspects of cities on the call. We'll highlight some of those people a little bit later in our kind of guest speakers that we've got. We wanted to foster and develop a community of systems innovators working with cities, and a great way of doing that again is to have a look at the Systems Innovation Network. And get involved in the cities channel, which is on there, and really wanted to bring together what is a global community of systems innovators, people interested in systems thinking, people interested in developing better futures for cities. How do we do that through systems innovation? That's a great forum to discuss those ideas. And outcomes, we were looking to spark interest to those new to the topic. So we expect that there'll be some people who are new to systems theory, to systems innovation, I'm relatively new myself and really enjoying exploring it, and great to do it with a community online. To develop a clear understanding of what systems innovation means in the context of cities. I think there'll be some really interesting points we can discuss later on, and we've got a lot of time at the end of this call to have some Q&A and discussion with the people we've got speaking about the challenge of putting some of the systems innovation, systems theory into practice in cities, and how do you do that? How do you find the right people to collaborate with? How do you grow an interest and grow a relationship within the city? And then we also wanted to initiate this community of practice, which we can help each other on our journeys as we learn more about systems theory, systems innovation. So that's kind of the purpose and the outcomes. So we've done our welcome now. We're going to roll into hearing from Joss very shortly. Did we give us an introduction into systems innovation in cities, and Joss has done some fantastic work on the subject already, and written some papers and produced some great resources. There's a systems innovation for cities toolkit, which we'll be pointing to. I think probably Joss will explain some of that on his bit, and at the end of the call we'll share that as well. From my side, we wanted to give a couple of stories around systems innovation in cities, and just kind of set some of the scene for hearing some more stories, really. So this is a session where there's a lot of stories we'll be learning and hearing about. So let's do that very quickly. 2 stories we've got to highlight, and then we've got some fantastic guest speakers, and we'll be sort of jumping around Europe anyway, or Northern Europe a little bit, which is quite exciting. So we'll hear from Mariana in Paris, and Noel in London, and David in Bristol. And we'll just ask them to sort of share for 10 minutes or so their experience of doing systems innovation within cities, and some of the challenges and successes they've had along the way. Just a note to the speakers, I hope everyone's on. If perhaps I think I saw Mariana, Noel I saw as well, David I think maybe snuck in. Thank you guys for being with us today. Fantastic to have you. We're going to do some Q&A at the end, so I think you might have some slides, and we'll make you hosts, and we'll let you show your screen and things like that. But we'll probably keep questions towards the end, I think, for everyone, and we'll host a bit of a panel, a bit of an open discussion with everyone we've got on the call. So I think that sounds good. What I'll do now is I'll stop sharing my screen, and I will invite Joss to roll into his first section. Joss, over to you. Joss, we can't hear you yet.
You're on mute.
Sorry about that, guys. Thanks a lot, James, and great to be here and see everyone, and get this ball rolling on what systems innovation might mean in the context of cities. I think it's kind of a new subject for all of us, really, and how we might do systems change in this context. What does systems thinking mean when applied to thinking about trying to understand cities and how to develop and design them? So that's what we're talking about today. And I'm going to jump into the presentation now. Hopefully it's all good with my screen. You can see it on full screen. Yeah, get a thumbs up, James. Yeah, cool.
Good, Joss.
So here we are, and I wanted to start with a little, well, actually, let me say a bit about this here. As mentioned there, the toolkits that James was just talking about. Sorry, I just need to shrink my screen here. There we go. As mentioned, James was just talking about a toolkit, but there's also a paper, and that's what today's presentation is based upon. You'll find these 2 resources on the website. Hopefully you'll share links there, James. You'll find all our resources about cities if you go to systemsinnovation.io and /cities, and everything's there. So the first one here is a paper on urban systems innovation. A couple of years ago, it's kind of research and analysis paper, painting the bigger picture, the wicked challenges, and how systems approaches might help us to respond to those. Second one is more recent, it's a couple of weeks ago. I was part of authoring and kind of curating both of these. This second one, the Cities Toolkit, just out a couple of weeks ago, and that's kind of bringing together a lot of our canvases and different tools, like guides, and again, thinking about how that can be used in the context of systems change for cities. So that's the presentation today is kind of a run through those ideas, that research, the analysis, and some of those tools. And it's a bit of a kind of a whirlwind tour. But I want to start with a little context. We know that there are some really big changes happening out there in the world, and that cities are really kind of at the epicenter of what's going on around technology, around sustainability, around globalization. And I think this kind of quote here captures so much of it for me. It's Nicholas Yu, urban specialist with UN Habitat. He says, the demographics of the world today show us that in the next 30 to 40 years, we'll see the doubling of the world's urban population. We'll build more cities, more infrastructure, more housing, more basic services than have been built since the beginning of humanity. And if we get that right, we have every hope of achieving sustainable development for everyone. If we do it wrong, we're in very serious trouble. So I think that kind of captures a few key aspects, but if we wanted one kind of graphic, is this one, right? In the course of 100 years, we're transitioning from predominantly living in a natural kind of world that was given to us by history and by evolution and so forth, to one that's designed and engineered and built by us. And as that quote just said, so much of that environment is being built right now over the next 30 years. So it's quite incredible how we have this capacity now to really shape the world we live in going forward in the future. And it's not, you know, not just for a few people, this is for billions of people. So we really have this incredible opportunity to shape our world, to shape systems, and in that to kind of do systems change through this process of urbanization and building out all this infrastructure and urban development and so forth over the coming decades. James, could you let the people in? Yeah, in the waiting room. Okay. And we know that can kind of go in different directions, right? But achieving sustainable solutions from the urban environment is both a huge challenge, as it's systemic, inherently complex, and multidimensional. At the same time, it's a huge leverage point, which is kind of what I'm getting at, in our capacity to shape our future environment at a scale and a speed, right? You think it's just a few decades this is playing out, and we'll all kind of live through this. We've never really seen that before, that scale, scope, and speed of urbanization, and the capacity to shape systems at such a degree. When things go right, we end up kind of in a world that looks a bit like this. It's Singapore, you know, it's clean, it's relatively good air quality, you got a lot of green space, good quality of life, you know, it's secure, so on and so forth. But of course, it doesn't always work out like that for a lot of people around the planet. They're moving into kind of mega cities in the emerging economies, Jakarta, this place here, Mexico City, and it doesn't look so good. It looks a bit like this, sprawling suburbs, and people are kind of actually disconnected. The city doesn't actually connect them in the way that it should into the global economy and all those opportunities. They end up in places like this, far from the city center. They have to commute for hours. They don't have good infrastructure, and it's not actually a good place, a world we really want to live in. But that's kind of a world for many hundreds of millions of people. And they spend a lot of time in places like this, right? Hours, Jakarta, commuting to work every day. And their quality of life is a seriously degraded quality of life, actually. It's not really the world we want to live in. And I'd say, you know, the point I want to get to is what's the difference between those two worlds? And I'd say it's this difference between kind of systems, cities as systems. The picture on the right here is kind of the place where people want to live. It's Barcelona. And what makes Barcelona and, you know, Singapore and so forth different from the others is they've built all these systems, haven't they, for transport, for telecommunications, so on and so forth. When the places on the left, the Jakartas and the Mexico cities, they haven't built all those systems, right? And it's really just a set of parts that don't really fit together at all very well. It doesn't deliver that functionality, all those different functionalities that people need to live. So that's kind of what this presentation is about, and what I think systems and systems innovation can add here. How do we really move from parts when it comes to cities and urban development and urban design to systems of systems and complex systems and so forth. So these environments can actually really deliver that functionality that's required of them going forwards. Of course, not just one system, right? It's many systems. Let me go back there. It's many systems, right? It's a system of systems, should we say. To deliver quality of life, it's all of these different systems, and not just individual, not just transport and commerce and finance and education and water and so forth. They all have to be working together, actually around the needs of the person, not working in different silos and separate domains. And what we're trying to do is really think about the city as a complex adaptive system, starting to design, starting to think first, right? Think differently. As we'll talk about here, I'll talk about systems thinking as a new kind of paradigm for understanding it. And that's going to be kind of the first condition for us to start to design, develop, and manage cities as complex adaptive systems that it's quite apparent that they are. But we haven't always really taken that approach, right? Urban development over the past hundreds of years, as with other areas, it's taken that kind of analytical reductionist approach. It's kind of a results in a management and development approach that's about ordered formal systems, one of planning, run by engineers and architects that divide up, separate out, and focus on the different domains, trying to kind of optimize those. The result is the creation of silos. We optimize solutions on the micro level. We want each part. We have all the transport engineers working there and all the water people working there and all the different domains. We end up with silos that work quite well individually, but not on kind of the macro level. We don't get that integration across the whole, and actually the whole thing kind of working in the way that's really needed. And we get that lack of integration and lack of interoperability. And a new approach is needed to really design cities in a way that enables the benefits of, well, information technology is one thing. We know the smart city now, it's going to cuts across all these different domains and starts to try and connect them and integrate them into processes. And but there's other dimensions to that, right? Climate change, it's going to give things like we see in China, that flooding across the cities. That's a cross-cutting thing. Everyone in that city, every department is going to experience that. Inequality is another example, right? These things that cut across these different verticals and domains. It's needed to meet the challenges of sustainability and build circular economies, right? It's a good example. Circular economy, it's not optimizing one part, it's not one green building, it's a whole decentralized infrastructure of collaboration between different organizations and the way we connect whole pile of different infrastructures, whole pile of different organizations across the entire city. So a new approach, a new way of thinking is actually needed, because our kind of traditional reductionist approach doesn't really equip us for these new challenges and these new opportunities. And it's really needed to meet the needs and expectations of citizens for a better quality of life. So it's thinking about the city as a system of systems, develop sustainable. This is what people talk about these days, right? The smart, sustainable, user-centered city. We need to start to think about them. You know, it's not, technology is not just going to get us there. It's thinking about them in a new way as systems and how all these different subsystems interrelate and coordinate. So this is what I'm going to talk about. That was a bit about the context. So this is a bit about kind of different dimensions to systems innovation and how they can really contribute and add value here. I'm going to talk about systems thinking, a bit about systems mapping and analysis as a way of mapping out a city and understanding its dynamics and how it's working. Actually, I think Mariana is going to talk a bit about that too in her presentation. Talk about systems change and kind of new approaches to managing complex adaptive systems, and a bit about systems building and systems design as a way to develop ecosystems and innovation ecosystems for kind of bringing neighborhoods alive and so forth. So that's what I'm going to touch upon. It's going to be kind of express. But before I jump into that, what is systems innovation? Some of you will be quite new to this. I'll just say a few words about that. So we get the idea of innovation as we can define it as the value-adding process of creating and applying new ideas. And there's two kinds of innovation. There's innovation in parts, and we know this quite well. And then there's innovation in systems. So innovation in parts, that's about a new way of solving a specific problem. It's typically quite technical, often coming out of kind of science. They might think about new kind of molecular structure for some material or something, and then that gets commercialized, gets brought to market, is packaged in a product, and is sold to customers. And that's one way of doing innovation. It's obviously just changing individual parts, not thinking about systems. Here we're thinking about how we actually do innovation on the level of whole systems and not just changing those individual parts. So it starts with a new way of thinking. So it's not a specific, this thinking isn't kind of a technical analytical way of thinking, a kind of an algorithmic way that's going to solve this particular problem. It's actually changing the paradigm, changing the way you're looking at that system. And that's coming from systems thinking that I'll talk about in a minute. And the innovation that comes from that is very different, right? And the innovation needed to actually change systems is one around changing the structure, changing the way the parts are organized in that system rather than changing the parts themselves. So that's the kind of innovation we're talking about when we talk about systems innovation. And I think it's something we're all kind of learning to do. It's something we need to learn to do, actually. It's quite apparent that we face these big challenges, and systems actually have to change at this stage on quite a fundamental level. Systems innovation is trying to provide us with the ideas, the tools, and so forth for us to be able to do that. I think there's two kind of key dimensions to that. One around thinking, right? Any kind of systems level innovation is going to have to come from some kind of systems level awareness, right? If we don't have that kind of view of the system in some way, it's inevitably going to be innovation in parts, I'd say. But it's more than that, right? It's not just ideas. Innovation is about applying those ideas. So it's also, as I say, about organization and the way we organize systems and organizing them in new ways, restructuring the system to create new patterns of organization that are more kind of new networked and decentralized and so forth. So that's a bit about systems innovation, and now talking about systems thinking, kind of the role of that, because the same old thinking, same old results, right? If we want to do this systems level innovation, as I say, it's going to have to come from a systems kind of awareness. Systems thinking, it's a paradigm, it's a worldview. That's the first thing to kind of understand about it. It's quite difficult for us to kind of get a head around that, like actually changing our whole worldview, our whole way of looking at the world. But that's what we're talking about here. Really trying to reframe things in a very different way. So it's this kind of holistic approach to thinking. It tries to understand and interpret phenomena with respect to the whole that they form part of. We contrast that to reductionist thinking that I've been touching upon here, which is very much characteristic of how we do a lot of things around here. We take some complex phenomenon, we break it up into a set of parts, and we kind of divide those out and try and solve the individual problems. And that kind of graphic there is illustrative of how we do a lot of things around here in our organizations. With the systems thinking, we're talking more about emergence, right? It's a question of what happens, not when we try and break things up and study the parts and control those parts, right? That's actually what we're trying to do there, and optimize the parts. But instead, what happens when we put things together in new ways and we get synergies between those parts? Potentially, if we do it in the right way, we get synergies between the parts, and then new levels, new capacities, new functions, new types of organization emerge out of that. And that's the idea of emergence, and how do we create the context for that kind of emergence as a way of kind of managing and developing systems, instead of this kind of reductionist approach where we try and separate out and control and optimize those individual parts. So again, that's real kind of paradigm shift, right? It's quite abstract kind of theory, and it takes a lot of thinking just to actually apply that and bring it down to ground. What does this really mean in this context? Reductionist thinking, as I kind of mentioned, results in processes. It's this linear way of thinking, right, that really pervades how we do urban development. Results in processes that are designed in isolation to function in a linear fashion, lacking integration with other systems. The results are a dead-end effect, right? If you focus on individual parts and you optimize those, it's that unintended consequences thing that people talk about in systems thinking, right? If you're just looking at the parts and you're not really looking at how they interoperate in the broader system, it's quite inevitable that you're not really going to get, there's going to be negative externalities. It's not going to work effectively with the other systems. And it often produces waste that is destructive to some other subsystem, rendering the whole less functional. It's a very kind of monodimensional approach, like that building is kind of characteristic of. Systems thinking is a more multi-dimensional approach. Looks at how different systems interrelate, synergies, how do we create synergies, may be achieved between them to create an integrated process. It's a multi-dimensional approach. Instead of separating out the functions, dividing a system up, a city up, should we say, into residential areas, commercial areas, office areas, so forth. We'll look at how we actually might put them together. I think that's kind of why the 15-minute city concept is quite expressive of this holistic approach. It actually runs very much contrary to what we did in the 20th century. When we built cities, if you look at them, right, just up my window, I've got Canary Wharf there, which is dominated by office buildings. It's the financial center, and it really focuses on one kind of function. And then we put the residential over there and the commercial over there. And what happens when you do that, you get to optimize those parts, right? You get very kind of good residential areas. It's very efficient on space and so forth, but you lose all the potential synergies. You lose the diversity and then you lose the synergies, right? So what happens, we're asking what happens actually when we start to put different things together, right? Instead of a building just being a building for people to sit in offices, that could be a place for generating energy. It could be a place for entertainment and residential and so forth. And actually, there can be synergies between those things. So that's the holistic integrative, and it's multi-dimensional, right? It's always looking at the kind of different dimensions to things. So this is, some ideas from systems thinking that will help us kind of shift our, it's not magic how you get to be a systems thinker. You got to kind of learn how to do this stuff, learn how to think in whole systems instead of parts, learn this emergence. What does that mean in these different contexts? How do I shift from kind of a linear way of looking at the world to a non-linear, cyclical, feedback way? How do I move from kind of disconnected to connected and a kind of dynamic way of looking at the world? And that will really, doing that will help us actually derive new ways of doing things and new ways of innovating, new solutions, new approaches, and so forth. So I think systems thinking is really key to innovation of most kind, right? Because it's really the outside the box thinking. The analytical thing is going to help us optimize our box and do things a bit better. This is going to help us really kind of think outside that. So yeah, linear approach. This is how we do a lot of our management, right? And particularly with cities for sure. Simplifying assumptions, the system's knowable, predictable, and controllable. And we're kind of arguing that complex adaptive systems, that cities are complex adaptive systems, and they're not really of that kind. They're more emergent, and they require a different kind of non-linear approach to change that hinges around the integration of networks and the development of context. You're working a lot more with context rather than specifying particular outcomes. We're investing in creating the right context for new functions and capacities to emerge. And I'll talk a little bit about systems gardening in a minute now as kind of one way of doing that. But again, it's a paradigm shift, right, in terms of our whole management approach. But it's really, we know from complexity theory, and complexity management, that this is the way to kind of manage complex systems and work with them, work with their potential, because they're these kind of living systems. You want them to kind of flourish, we say, and provide the context for that in terms of, instead of trying to just control and specify particular outcomes. So that's a bit about the systems thinking thing. These are some of the tools we have in that section, guides and canvases. You know, some of these, the iceberg model, there's systems thinking canvas, and there's one for ecosystem thinking. And yeah, we have one for emergence, just to start, help people to kind of start thinking differently, really, and work through that. So here, I'm going to jump into systems mapping too, as kind of a set of tools for us to help to understand the system. You know, that was just changing all our thinking. Now we've actually got to look at this urban environment that we're dealing with and really kind of dig into what's actually going on here. How's this thing connected? What are the elements? Who are the actors? Of course, we shouldn't be changing anything in a complex system without actually understanding what we're doing or what this thing looks like, or else we're definitely going to get those unintended consequences. So systems analysis and inquiry is about gaining a holistic overview of the system and how the parts interrelate to form the whole. And yeah, we have tools around systems mapping, the elements and how they interrelate. We need to understand the actors, right? If we're going to make any changes here, if we're going to do anything, you need to know who's involved and what are their motives and so forth. Systems dynamics, understanding the flows, the stocks, the kind of feedback loops in the system and so forth. A bit of network analysis to understand the structure of that network. I'll just flick through some of those so you can see a bit what they might look like. Well, firstly, like this is the advantage of a kind of systems mapping approach or systems inquiry. It's holistic. We look at the whole. It gives us an understanding of the structure of the system. It helps develop shared perspective, because you should be doing this kind of collectively with people who you're planning to change the system with. And so you're building up a shared understanding, which is really the foundations for being able to do any sort of systems change. Otherwise, you're all going to be, and I've seen that picture of the elephant and the blind men, you're all kind of pulling on different parts of the elephant. You don't know, you don't have a shared understanding, so you can't really change something together without that. And it then provides a course of action. If you can kind of understand that system and have a shared understanding of what works, what doesn't work, where we want to go and so forth, and what are the linkages and connections and elements, you can think about where might we intervene in that. So it's really the kind of foundations for doing systems change, this systems mapping. And these are some of the guides and some of the canvases we have. I'll quickly flick through some of those. Yeah, the systems model. It's going to help us think about the function of the system, what's a desirable outcome, what's kind of dysfunctional and so forth. We've probably seen some of these, like a materials kind of flow system in a city. What are the inputs, the outputs? What are the elements? This is a very kind of zoomed out view of the whole thing, just for us to ask some very kind of basic questions. What are the main elements? What are the main relationships? How do they interrelate? And what is the kind of function or the process of this overall system? Or what's kind of entropy? What's a dysfunctional outcome, waste if you want, and what's a functional one? So it's a very general model, but it really helps us ask some kind of basic questions and contextualize the whole city or what neighborhood, whatever we're dealing with as a system. And then actor mapping, thinking about the actors in that, their values, their powers, incentives, so on and so forth. And systems dynamics, what are the stocks? How are things flowing through this, right? It could be materials. This could be about circular economy. What are the actual resources flowing through it? Where are the stocks? Where are the accumulation? Where's all the rubbish ending up, should we say? It could be finance, right? How's money flowing through this system? Where does all the money accumulate? Where are the scarcities and who's kind of regulating those flows? Could be water, could be many different things, transport, so on and so forth, or the flow of people. But very, very useful tool for thinking about how things flow through a system. And of course, network analysis is kind of an extension of that. It's just zooming more into kind of the structure of the system and thinking about structural aspects. What's kind of, is this centralized? Is it decentralized? Is it resilient? What's diffusion, right? That would have a lot of relevance. We talk about COVID. How if there's a transport system, well, how would a pandemic pass through that? And what happens if it becomes more centralized or if it becomes more decentralized, so on and so forth? Is that going to help with, say, inequality, economic inequality, so on and so forth, or traffic? You know, you think about this also. So very useful for really digging in and kind of analyzing the structure of a system and how it's working in that respect. So yeah, I'm going to flick through last ones quite quickly. This one's systems change. So again, thinking about complex adaptive systems, and they look a bit like these flock of birds. So the question is, how do you change something like that, right? A kind of command and control approach probably isn't going to work very well. If you go running in there and try and grab some birds, they're not really going to do what you want them to do, you know? So how are you actually going to change something like that? It's going to take a very different kind of approach. And we know countless attempts to kind of influence and change complex adaptive systems like healthcare systems, they kind of end up on the rubbish dump because the thing doesn't actually want to do what you want it to do, and you're really working against it instead of. The question is, how can we actually work with it? How can we actually work with the innate kind of potential of that system? Instead of thinking about it as some kind of a machine or something, we can control it, to predict it. How can we actually look at it as a complex living system, use the potential of that to actually influence and change it? So yeah, some of the characteristics of systems change. And this is one canvas put together recently. It kind of brings together different aspects of transition processes in complex adaptive systems, because that's kind of what systems change is about. You can't directly control and change a complex system. You kind of influence and guide it during a transition process. And this is building upon a few different models, the multi-level perspective and the two loops model. Some of these ones here, you'll find them on our website. They'll really help you think about how large-scale transition processes take place within complex adaptive systems. There's different models, guides, and so forth. Yeah, I'll just jump into kind of one of those around systems gardening that I mentioned as an approach to working with context and working with living systems in the way that a gardener does, right? Gardener's not a mechanic working with a car. They're working with plants that grow themselves to a certain extent, and they're just working with the context. They know they have to create the right context, and the plants are actually going to do the work themselves to a certain extent. And wouldn't that be exactly what we want when it comes to regenerating a neighborhood or something, right? We've got people in that neighborhood. Couldn't they do that themselves if we created the right context, instead of actually trying to kind of plan the whole thing out and so forth? So this is systems gardening, and aims at the emergence. Systems gardening is to create the context for the emergence of beneficial outcomes. And this is done a bit like this. You'll find it in our guide and so forth on the website. It's kind of building upon the work of David Snowden and his understanding of how to manage complex adaptive systems and guide them. You're creating boundary kind of conditions, and then you're running different experiments in the system and seeing which ones kind of lead to beneficial outcomes or which one leads to kind of detrimental outcomes, right? And then amplifying those ones that are beneficial and working well, and obviously dampening down the others in the way that a gardener would do. And you can definitely think about how that might apply in the context of, he gives the example of a children's party, but you can think about, you know, regeneration of a neighborhood or kind of economic development within a city, developing a kind of innovation startup community, so on and so forth. And it's really the way to work with complex adaptive systems and working with their kind of innate potential. Okay, finally, a little bit about systems building. This is how we create ecosystems within a city. To transform a system, ultimately, we're going to have to develop some new way of organizing people, new networks or new platforms, new ways of connecting people for them to create kind of beneficial outcomes together. The job of the systems innovator is to develop collaborative ecosystems that align diverse actors in synergistic ways. And it's this ecosystem kind of concept, putting people and organizations together in ways that are kind of greater than the sum of the parts. You know, that we have in these cities, we have a lot of people, an organization is already doing stuff. And how could we connect them and build platforms and so forth that are really going to kind of put them together in in ways, in beneficial ways. You might think about in a community like this, kind of education or something. We have a school there already, and we have the teachers and so forth, but there's probably many different learning opportunities in that environment. How can we put them together in new ways to create a kind of learning ecosystem? So we're working to enable others to be more productive as a whole community, creating platforms for them to do that. The platform facilitates and enables the creation exchange of value between members. Circular economy, kind of a platform would be another example. How could we create a kind of ecosystem here in London for different organizations to exchange different resources and materials and so forth in a way that they aren't doing at the moment because the cost is too expensive. If we could kind of facilitate those interactions, create that coordination, create that platform, that could really be a value to them. So this is kind of what I mean by an ecosystem, just touching upon some of the different dimensions to it here. You know, you can have different, you're gonna have to have some kind of platform, some kind of orchestrator there in the center that's kind of providing the infrastructure. And you can have different roles as part of that, different kind of members and so forth. There are going to be activities for them to work together. It's going to have some kind of identity. You know, what's all this about? What are we doing together? There's going to have to be a value model. How's this really creating value for the actors in the system? If you don't get that right, everybody's going to kind of quit after a while because they don't see the benefit in it. And assessment, right? How's learning? How's investment? How we're assessing for impact, so on and so forth. And that's the ecosystem concept, and it can be kind of applied in many different dimensions. Say it could be education, could be finance, could be circular economy, so on and so forth. So that's that. I want to wrap up now. I think my time is probably up or over. I think this quote kind of captures so much for actually kind of 21st century reality. And it's really a question of, for me, whether we can work with, I guess the presentation was about how can we kind of work with cities as complex adaptive systems that they are, and really learn how to kind of harness those new ideas and use them to design and develop cities as kind of systems of systems that really work for people and environment in the way that's needed. Okay, I'll wrap up there. I'll hand it back to you again, James.
Cool, thanks, Joss. Yeah, so much, isn't there? You know, clearly a huge subject, and I think as Joss pointed out, there's you know, a lot more resources, and that's now all for now, folks. Yeah, there's a lot more resources on the Systems Innovation website. So I think the links have been shared in the chat. So yeah, have a look at that, and yeah, there's also the cities kind of a group forum on there for us to connect after this call and keep sort of talking about it, and you know, sort of establishing this learning community really. We're running a little bit over on time, so I'll just be really quick on my next bit, and I'll just work out how I present and share my screen at the same time. So give me a second. Okay, I think I'm okay. Yep. Okay, cool. So yeah, when we've got our guest speakers coming up as well. So yeah, I'll just rattle through a little bit on here. But what we wanted to do was just sort of following the sort of some of the theory and kind of methodology around systems thinking, just provide a couple of different stories, and there's some more detail on these on the Systems Innovation website as well. It's just two stories to highlight systems approaches and tackling city challenges. So we've got Mexico City, a challenge around water management, and Glasgow as well around knife crime. And I think sort of wrapping back to what Joss was describing there as well about finding different new ways or different ways of organizing systems and seeing the whole rather than parts, and dealing with unintended consequences and sort of building that resilience within cities is core to these stories as well. So yeah, let's have a look here. Cool. So this is Mexico City, and this story is about Mexico City and its water management. So Mexico City is built on an ancient lake bed, and we know it's one of the most kind of rapidly developing cities in the world. Now it's a city of 9 million people. But as the city's developed on this ancient lake bed, natural water resources have been depleted, and combine that with poor infrastructure and leaking pipework, 250,000 people within the city actually struggle without clean water. At the same time, it's actually got a higher, due to its geographical location, it's got a higher rainfall than many cities around the world, and more than London as well. So there's this huge problem with surface flooding in the city as well. So the city spends a lot of money, dealing with excess surface water and then pumping fresh water back in. In 2017, a huge earthquake rocked the city. Pipelines burst, streets flooded with water and waste as well, and 4 million people were cut off from clean water. So what do? Well, this organization, Isla Urbana, began installing these rainwater harvesting systems. So what they did was they connected them up to the roof spaces and gutters, particularly within a few poorer communities in the city. And throughout the rainstorms, they would collect water, they would store it in the sanitary ways, and then they'd capture so much water after the rainy season, they're actually able to share surplus water with other communities and neighbours as well, and strengthening community bonds. This is a really sort of powerful way of saying that through some very simple technology, we don't need to be using AI and robotics and things like that, and data modeling. This is just a very simple technology attached to gutters and using buckets to create more storage, sanitized storage in the city. So it's a good success story. So the Mexican government's now supporting the rollout through the city, and the goal is to reach 100,000 systems within the city by 2024. It's really a story of decentralization, of how distributed systems can bring resilience to communities. No single point of failure, no reliance on sort of centralized infrastructure there, and about building capacity and capability within communities and people connecting with those natural ecosystems that they live independently with. From east to west, we go over to Glasgow, and this is a story about the challenge of knife crime in the city. So Glasgow in Scotland, which is north of the UK, is really recognised now as being a European city of culture, but it previously in its past has a reputation for being one of the most violent cities in Europe. And they had a huge issue with young people being involved in violent crime and knife crime in particular. But what they decided to do was, instead of dealing with the issue through the criminal justice system, was to adopt a public health approach to dealing with the issue. And Glasgow became the first city in the world where they took this public health approach to tackling knife crime and gang violence. So they stated it as a public health issue, just like measles or tuberculosis or COVID now. And they started to talk about how people caught the disease of street violence, who was at risk, what they could do to target the vulnerable, and what inoculation would look like as well. So they reframed knife crime as a disease of epidemic proportions, and a disease which was the product of shared violence between gang members, of communities entrenched in economic inequality, domestic violence, drugs and worklessness, and one which needed tackling like a public health emergency as well. So what do you do? What's the World Health Organization advice on how to stop epidemics? Well, we're probably quite used to some of that now, but this is the three things you do is interrupt transmission, you change behavior, and you change norms. And those were some of the key principles they took in their approach. The lady down the bottom of the picture here is Karen McCluskey, and she was really the founder and the lead for the approach. And she's an excellent speaker and a real, really powerful lady who was sort of at the center of coordinating this citywide response. And she's got a really good YouTube video from a TED talk that she did. We'll share that link as well. She has a great saying, which is, you can do anything if you find enough positive architects who want to go in the same direction. So I think it's really great mindset to have, particularly when you're looking at systems change as well. And so what they did is they did some more gang intervention, but this time they really did it, took a really kind of strong listening approach. They didn't just share information and share what the kind of retributions would be in terms of the criminality of what people were doing, but they got families and mothers of people who've been killed by knives in the city to go and talk to gangs, and they listened to what the gangs were saying. and gang members were telling them that without a gang, I'm nothing. So they didn't lack information on the crimes that they were getting involved in. The key was giving people a choice. They felt they had no choice. They felt that they had no choice about where they were born, who their parents were, where they lived, what the schooling was like. So what Karen and the team did was to look at specific system interventions where they could offer different choices and different decisions could be taken. So the city formed a collaborative coalition across the police, health services, local authorities, housing, job provision and education centres, and they provided all of that support just through one phone number. So that was the platform approach. It was providing one phone number where gang members could get someone to come and see them and talk to them about an action plan of how do they actually change their lives, what other decisions and choices do they have in lives. And it gave them also direct access to all the services they might need, so health, housing, education, etc. Just to wrap that bit up, so the coalition working together created more effective ways of multi-agency collaboration and better early intervention. And the city, which had a problem with 3,500 gang members, successfully delivered interventions to many hundreds of them, and the city's been a great example around the world of how do you deal with the challenge of knife crime in cities. So again, just to reflect, this is a story of how to reframe social challenges or societal challenges as systemic challenges. It was about them taking a systems inquiry approach, doing some of that systems mapping and learning from the system and doing some systems modeling and looking at the actors, who do they need to work with. And it was about forming these city coalitions and collaborations and using a co-production approach to design better system interventions. And that is that from me. I will stop sharing my screen. Stop share. Great. So what we're going to do now is we're going to jump through to some of our guests, and any questions you might have for them, please put in the chat and we'll put those up at the end. But we're delighted to be joined by 3 guests doing systems leadership work across 3 different cities. So Mariana, if you were there and ready, if you'd like to, I think you should be able to share your screen. And Mariana has asked a favour as well, if some of us could stop sharing our videos, because she's got a bit of a dodgy internet connection there. So that might just help her out. But we'll say hello to her first on screen. And yeah, Mariana, over to you.
Sure, many thanks. Just a logistic thing. I cannot share the screen. If you can allow me to. Really sorry for that. I'm renting a place where they said internet would work better than what it actually does. So I will turn my webcam on, and if you can as well, that could help. Let me just maybe introduce myself. My name is Mariana Mirabile. I was lucky enough to come across systems innovation 2 years ago when trying to know more about system thinking, and in particular, understand how to concretely apply it to solve problems. So the notion of systems innovation really got my attention. I am currently working at the OECD. I work as an economist and as a policy analyst of climate change related policies. And I will be presenting very briefly some work we are doing, in particular in the transport and urban systems, where we try to help governments to apply system thinking. And this work is greatly inspired by the content shared in systems innovation. So let me share my screen. So you should be able to see it. And I will stop my video now. I'm really sorry for that. So basically, I will be talking a little bit about the mindsets that have shaped and are still shaping our cities. I will then briefly describe what we found to be the transport and urban systems functioning in most territories. And I will then introduce the 15-minute cities framework, which is in a way a different way of thinking and of seeing cities. As just mentioned, I will be touching upon thinking, mapping, and change a little bit, and I will be illustrating that with an example. So let me start with the mindsets. A key idea, in particular from the 40s or 50s on, is that streets belong to cars. Cars have been linked to notions such as freedom, progress, power, status, virility. And then the increase in car traffic that we see is often seen as inevitable. It's the inevitable result of development, because as income increases, people choose to buy cars. They have the right to do that. There is a very interesting work by a historian called Peter Norton that explains how we got into these ideas. They were not always there. I can share a few links if any of you is interested. Now, the result of this mindset are decisions focused on accommodating cars, on setting the conditions so that people can drive to places. Not access places, drive to places. And as soon as cars became popular, congestion started to increase. Congestion can be seen as there being too many cars for too few roads. Now, too many cars we just saw, that's inevitable. So we need to build roads. And that's been what we have been doing for decades now. The logic being, if we build roads, congestion will go up. And that is a very clear example of linear thinking. If I do A, then B happens. Stop. End of the story. Except that complex systems are nonlinear. Linear thinking, as just mentioned, leave us ill-equipped to understand the functioning of the systems we're trying to change. And thus, we find solutions that are not really so. This takes me to the next part of the presentation. What we find when we actually observe the systems functioning by using system thinking, we see that when we invest in roads and we increase the road's capacity, there is indeed reduced congestion and the travel time is reduced. It doesn't, however, stop there, because as soon as one can move faster with cars, then more people choose to drive cars, which increases traffic volume and congestion again, and increases travel time again, which lead us to build more roads. So note how a visual tool, a very simple visual tool, there are arrows and a few words, it's called a causal loop diagram, allows us to see the nonlinearities in systems. It is not if A, then B. There are feedbacks. The interactions and nonlinearities do not stop there. The more roads, then the bigger the size of the region within which I can move to and still get to the city in a reasonable time budget, right? I don't know, 20 minutes by car. Now, the more roads, then the more people move away from the city, often to less dense and residential areas, which increases the need for cars and increases traffic volume again. The need for cars increases because urban planning also follows a linear logic. Just talked about parts versus systems and how we tend to divide things. And indeed, what we observe in most cities, and maybe it's the case in yours, we have all services clustered in the city center, huge residential area, offices clustered in another district, and then a few malls here and there. So we need to travel long distances to meet every need. Now, these two dynamics that in transport jargon can be called induced demand and urban sprawl lead to a third dynamic, which is the reduction of the attractiveness of transport modes, of sustainable transport modes. Basically, walking and cycling is no longer an option if you need to travel 30 kilometers to go to your office, which you likely do in the urban planning we just saw. Public transportation is also less attractive because you likely do not have a bus stop near your place, so it takes longer. And you may notice that these dynamics, this system functioning, that is a result of the design we chose for our cities, is creating the opposite conditions that what we need, for example, to reduce emissions or to reduce air pollution, because it is increasing car attractiveness and dependency, and it is reducing the attractiveness and thus the number of people that choose to walk, cycle, or use public transport. Now, the good news, because there are good news, is that these dynamics are not physical laws. They can be changed. But to change them, first and foremost, we need to think in systems, which leads me to the last part of my presentation. The 15-minute city framework is this idea that rather than dividing things up and centralizing stuff, we can instead create a network of neighborhoods with access, each of them, to all services. We can still move from a neighborhood to another if we want to, but we do not need to. We can really meet our needs by walking or cycling in less than 15 minutes. This idea basically doesn't optimize a part of the system, it changes the way the parts are organized. And that changes everything. This idea, the 15-minute city, is already guiding decisions in cities like Paris and in other cities such as Milan, Barcelona, Melbourne, and Pontevedra in Spain. Among others, there are many. Now, if we look at it at the level of a single street, it looks like this. For example, rather than using public space for car storage, which we would do here and here, we can use it for other uses. We can extend shops, we can have green areas, we can use it for recreation. And depending, of course, on how the street is designed, you get certain results and not others. Notice that what is interesting with this systemic innovation that the 15-minute city framework allows us to do is that while changing the way we organize things, we actually get to solve multiple problems at the same time. In the city, emissions are lower. You have healthier citizens because they are doing physical activity. Air quality is slightly better. You likely have better interactions between people, which may contribute to solve the loneliness problem that we have in many of our societies. Kids may have the right, again, to play in the street, which they don't in most cities. You may have local shops that have more customers. So just in a nutshell, our cities have been shaped with a car-centric and linear mindset. The systems that result from this mindset are car-dependent, which lead to increased traffic volume and air pollution and emissions. We can do better than that. And the 15-minute city is just one example of how thinking differently can lead to better systems for better lives. Many thanks.
Thank you, Mariana. So inspiring, and yeah, I love the view of the 15-minute city. What we'll do now is we'll go on to Noel Hatch, who's our next presenter. And Noel, if you could just keep an eye on time as well. We're running quite a bit behind, and we've got another 2 10-minute presentations coming up. So Noel, if you keep to your 10 minutes, that'd be fantastic, and we'll try and squeeze in a bit of discussion, Q&A towards the end, or maybe we can run over a little bit if people are keen to stay. But thanks, Mariana. And Noel, you should be able to share your screen, and over to you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, James. I will just put this on a slideshow, and do cut me off if I'm running over. So I'm going to talk about systems innovation in London, but from a particular lens. And I guess the 3 things I'm going to talk about is kind of thinking about the future trends that are emerging in the city, and then thinking about how we reach systems innovation in our local identities. And there'll be some similarities or complementarities with Mariana's presentation. And then actually, like, what does system innovation look like at a human scale? And I'll give 2 or 3 examples of that. So I should have said I'm head of policy and research at UM, which is local borough in London, famous for hosting the Olympics. We've done some work on kind of mapping what future trends are emerging in London. You can see the interactive version when you click on the PDF in the link, but some of the kind of the key spillover effects we're seeing actually show that kind of the impacts and behaviors that like we each have wider impacts on the way the economy is organized, the way services are provided, and actually, you know, how our public spaces are used and how infrastructure is developed, whether that's, you know, kind of how we use technology in terms of what that means for how services are provided and how we look after each other. So, you know, kind of people that are kind of like very networked and kind of use technology in a very connected way is very different from people that expect a kind of very personalized service. And that has implications for peer-to-peer support, particularly in the context of a pandemic. But we can also see through actually the kind of like neighborhoods, due to kind of the way that neighborhoods have been developed, both physically and the kind of the social brands that they have, actually creating greater polarization. So where you live actually has a kind of a big impact on the system around you. And even within a city like London, there are different systems of support that you can access based on the neighborhood you live in, both in terms of formal support from public services and charities, but also, you know, other support in terms of basic essentials like businesses and your social networks. And I think we can see in terms of also the changes in, you know, kind of the type of social networks we have, whether they're thick ties like families or rather kind of looser ties like our neighbours or colleagues, also has an impact on kind of levels of transience in neighbourhoods and kind of what that means for the infrastructure that's built in a neighbourhood. So before, you might have had a strong system because there were highly established sets of communities and businesses within a neighbourhood, whereas now actually there's much more kind of insecurity and transience within neighbourhoods in terms of those systems. And then likewise, in terms of, you know, how the economy kind of organises and how public services organises, will need to adapt and kind of react to actually kind of real blurring between forms of employment and forms of care as well. We could see that through the gig economy, and we've seen that again in the pandemic in terms of different caring responsibilities that came up. And then there's some impacts in terms of economic behaviours that kind of people are demonstrating, and also that businesses are demonstrating, that have wider impacts on kind of like what needs a particular community has, and then therefore kind of what needs a local economy can provide. And some might feel very positive, and some might feel very negative as well. And like, you know, like anything, these trends aren't kind of nil-sum games. So actually understanding the potential spillovers and looking at how we can influence them is really important. But all of this, you know, kind of really set in a context of, you know, how people have experienced the pandemic and some of the behaviours, invisible behaviours of solidarity that have kind of materialised, that also have an impact on how we organise ourselves within a city and within the network of neighbourhoods that Mariana talks about. And actually that has implications for where public services go, and that's the kind of the sector I'm in. And that doesn't just have implications for people that use those public services, but it also has implications, of course, for communities, but also for businesses themselves. So if you have a strong city or local government that is investing in kind of the local community and in the local economy, that has implications for the infrastructure that businesses can benefit from in terms of attracting innovative people to come and work in that neighbourhood, or infrastructure that enables businesses to take advantage of that as part of their supply chain, whether that's investing in the circular economy or in the digital economy as well. And it also provides the opportunity or not, or the infrastructure or not, in the ability of communities to be able to embed their solidarity into new forms of business model. We can see that through the development of cooperatives or even platform cooperatives, which are kind of a digital form, particularly in terms of making, for example, the gig economy more ethical. But then this comes on to kind of the second point, which is actually, kind of cities are more than a set of functional infrastructures and functional set of demographics and sectors, and each city, and in fact each neighborhood, has its own personality. And I think a kind of a litmus test for neighborhoods to be able to really develop their systems for the future, their social infrastructure for the future, will be the ability to define themselves strongly in terms of their identity and how that translates in terms of the economy. And this kind of diagram here shows how certain cities have really done that. For example, Copenhagen in terms of being livable city, Bristol in terms of being that playful city, and that opens up opportunities for different sectors and systems to connect together in ways that just being quite functional set of neighborhoods doesn't. But then this is really evolving with the neighborhood. Like, what position does the neighborhood have in relation to the city centre? And we definitely see this in London, where neighbourhoods within the city centre are probably struggling for a sense of identity now, because they're dependent on commuters, and those commuters are, in some instances, or many instances, perfectly happy in a neighbourhood which is maybe closer to the 15-minute neighbourhood that Mariana talked about than the city centre is, which then has implications for the neighbourhoods they live in to develop more greater systems of proximity and businesses that have greater markets that they can access to those local people. And then
just want to give you 2 minutes there to finish up, if that's okay.
No worries. I'll skip this slide. So there are just a couple of slides on some examples. So I think, based on what I said in terms of how do you really define those identities, is creating immersive ways that people can really experience the type of futures they'd like to see in their neighbourhoods. So kind of a couple of examples here. One which is cross-sector collaboration between property developer council and community organisation about how we tackle loneliness in public space and develop prototypes. And another one about kind of reimagining our libraries as civic spaces. And then actually, how do we experiment ways to bring that to life? So an example here, which is actually devolving budgets, this is from the council I work in, to communities and to businesses to actually develop new forms of economy at scale. And then Inclusive Innovation District, which is in the Olympic area, which is actually saying, how can businesses in that area, whether they're universities or whether they're startups or whether they're investors, really take a kind of an inclusive approach? What does that mean in terms of the prototypes that what we might develop, whether that's developing fairer legal access or tackling the poverty premium. And then finally, and this connects right back to kind of like Mariana's presentation, is actually you devolve right down to that scale. You're more likely for different sectors to be able to work together as part of a supply chain than necessarily at a kind of a full city level. So I think, to conclude, really something about neighborhoods being able to develop strong sense of identities to then be able to translate that to mobilize communities and economies to work together to turn those identities into strong models of support and an inclusive economy. That was me.
Thank you, Noel. Yeah, there's so much to unpack, isn't there, with all these presentations, and we can only get sort of a flavour of it. But thank you for walking us through that. We will move on to David, who's one of my colleagues in Bristol, and you should be able to share your screen. David, if you could keep an eye on the clock as well, and yeah, try and stick with sort of 10 minutes or so. Then what we think we'll do is we'll extend the meeting by about 10 minutes to try to look to finish at about 7:10, because it'd be great to try and get a few questions and a bit of a discussion going. But I think we're gonna have to come back another day as well and pick it up. So I hope everyone's keen for that. But David, over to you.
Great, thank you, James. I hope you can see my slides. So just want to explain very briefly a bit about the one city approach, as it's known in Bristol here in the UK. And so what is the problem that the one city approach is trying to solve? It was identified by the incoming mayor, current mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees, that Bristol was a city with hundreds of unaligned strategies, many of which were quite short-term in nature, and that there was no framework to easily bring together leaders of different organisations across the city. And the mayoral position in Bristol was quite a new one. And Marvin, as mayor, I think very much had a vision for what that role could be, which was about convening and bringing people together across different sectors. And he was inspired in a lot of his thinking on that by a local academic called Robin Hambleton from the University of the West of England, who's done a lot of thinking about the infrastructure that's needed to create and to foster cross-sector collaboration at the city level. And so that's really where this one city vision came from. And it started really with a conversation, what was known as the first kind of city gathering, where the new mayor at the time brought together leaders from the universities, from business, from civil society. And the argument he made was that if you look at the combined spending and the combined resources of the organizations in the room, you know, it was running to the billions, and huge numbers of people that were being employed by these organizations. And his kind of challenge to those people was, what problem could we not solve if we aligned those resources, if we actually worked together? What issue in this city would be impossible for us to tackle? And that was the challenge that led to the development of this one city infrastructure. And so key part of that is what's now called the One City Plan. And the One City Plan is about pooling a collective vision for the city, not just for the next 5 years, but actually all the way up to 2050. So trying to take a long-term view on what we want the city to look like. But alongside that One City Plan is the idea of creating a framework for cross-sector city leadership and moving from what Marvin, the mayor, calls a model of city government to a model of city governance, of leaders of organizations working collectively together to tackle big issues. So this is what the One City Plan looks like. It's grounded in the Sustainable Development Goals, which kind of run through it. And it's split into these different sections, these different themes. And each theme has particular goals or targets every year, all the way between now and 2050. But those targets and those plans are iterated every year. And the body that does that kind of iteration work is a board that has been created for each of these different themes. And those thematic boards are made up of representatives from different sectors. So from civil society, business, public sector, a whole range of different perspectives and different kinds of resources. And so you probably might struggle to see this, but what this image represents is a kind of meeting pulse that runs through the year in the city. And so each of those different bits of this model represent different meetings. So the different thematic groups meet regularly, but then the chairs of those thematic boards meet regularly as well. They come together to try and spot the synergies and the overlap between the different themes. And then once every 6 months, we have this big city gathering, which is a kind of doors open, particularly now that it's gone virtual, you know, everyone welcome event to share progress, but also crucially to vote on what the key priorities are for the city. So there's a sense of kind of civic open participation in this process. And so here, just to give you a feel, here are the 3 top priorities that were voted on for 2021. One was about digital exclusion. One was about pathways to Bristol's 2030 zero carbon goal in the lead up to COP, which is happening in the UK. And then one was about social isolation and mental well-being. And that kind of sets the marker for what are the key themes that that collaboration then should be happening around. And for some of those bigger targets, those bigger goals, like the climate, the zero carbon strategy and other things, there's been some specific work, I think, taking into account a lot of what's been talked about in today's meeting, to think about what are the systemic changes that are required to get us to some of those bigger goals. So I think having that longer time frame creates the space and the incentive perhaps for people to think slightly differently about what is really going to be required to hit some of those big targets. What's really interesting is, I guess, what sits underneath some of this is a small team which James used to be part of, which he helped to create really, and which I've then been privileged to be play a little part in more recently, called the City Office. And the City Office is a kind of dynamic secretariat which exists to service those boards that I talked about and to make that meeting structure work, but also exists to catalyze and to support collaborative action across the city. So I've got a particular remit around migrant inclusion in Bristol, and we've ended up taking a real kind of one city approach to thinking about how do we support vulnerable migrants who don't have access to public funds during the COVID pandemic. And we've been able to mobilize the different resources of different bits of the city to make sure that the people who were housed on a temporary basis during COVID were actually able to address some of the underlying issues they were facing around their immigration status or other things, so that they could move on successfully when that temporary accommodation came to an end. So that's the kind of role that the City Office can play of bringing people together and fostering those collaborative, innovative conversations. And then the final piece of the puzzle, piece of the infrastructure, is what's called city funds. And so you've got the plan that pulls the vision, you've got the office that brings together the kind of human resources, as it were, and then you've got city funds, which pulls the different kinds of financial resources. So you've got grant funding, social investment, and blended finance tools available. And it was kicked off by a £10 million social investment fund, invested in partly by the council, but matched also by a national organisation called Big Society Capital. And we've had a particular grant fund that's been focused on health and well-being. And I've been quite heavily involved in that. And my role in that has been trying to align some of that money, that pot of grant funding, with what's coming through the other bits of the system, the One City system, in terms of that goal that we looked at a second ago around mental health and social isolation. And the thinking that has sparked is around this idea of a city lab. And what we want to try and do with the city lab is think about, we've got money over here and we've got targets and goals and leaders coming together over there. But what we need, of course, is to create some ideas in the middle that can take some of those targets and goals and harness some of that energy, but turn it into fundable propositions that have that potential for systemic impact. And so that's what we're trying to create with this City Lab process. It's something which is an inclusive process that engages local people with lived experience of the issues, but which also gives them the tools and the support that they might require to try and come up with creative solutions. So it's great timing for me to learn so much more today from you guys about about systems thinking, because I think we can try and, there's a great platform in Bristol now to try and feed some of that thinking and operationalize it using some of these different bits of kind of collaborative infrastructure that I've just mentioned. So I will finish there.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I mean, all three fantastic presentations. So thank you, Mariana, Noel, David, and Joss for taking some time to prepare for sharing what you guys are up to today. So yeah, round of applause. You can do the virtual clap on Zoom nowadays, can't you? So well, that's always exciting. Yeah, I think we kind of overrun a little bit, but what we're going to do for those who can stay for another 15 minutes or so is run to about 7:10 UK time. Now, I don't know what time that is around the world because we've got so many different locations, which is exciting in itself. But we'll run for another 15 minutes or so. I've got loads of questions, but rather than sort of being too selfish and hogging all the time, we wanted to offer the opportunity for people to sort of ask questions. So if anyone's quick to the draw and wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, we'll go for it. Or if you'd like to put your hand up, or questions for David, Noel, Mariana, Joss, thoughts, questions for the group.
Yeah, actually, I have one really quick, James, if you guys don't mind. So I had asked it in the chat as well. Myself and a lot of our team is actually on this call. We do a lot of stuff with AI, especially around connected vehicles and things like that. But as we're trying to do more and more with service design and systems thinking and stuff, I was curious about what types of prototypes you guys like to put together. Like, what are those what is the output of that when you guys do a lot of the research and synthesis, and you're trying to put together new, solutions for things with cities and stuff? Like, is it a lot of drawings and artwork? And I was just curious about that.
Yeah, Joss, Mariana, you guys might have some thoughts on that.
I think maybe Mariana does, like, in terms of that systems map, that is something of an output that she's been introducing, I think, to different governments in terms of a way for them to start thinking holistically about their transport system, to decarbonize it and so on. So a map like that can be an output. But, one thing about systems change, it's not a kind of a solutions sort of thing, right? Which it's about co-creation, it's about creating platforms for other people, as we kind of heard there in Bristol. It's about creating platforms and things like living labs, where we can not do things for people, but create those spaces for them to get them together and provide that kind of context and infrastructure for them to kind of create their own solutions, right? To support them in that. So I guess I've given you two answers there. But yeah, I think maybe Mariana wants to say more on that.
I think you covered it. Okay.
Yeah, no, that was great. That was great, Joss. Yeah, I was trying to just see, for us, that would be more of like service design blueprints or user journeys or all of those sorts of things too. Mm-hmm. So I was just curious how some of that was handled.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. I think it's really interesting. One of the things we're trying to do here was kind of like, you utilize this sort of collective intelligence of 65 plus people on the call, 80 earlier, of great examples and work which is happening around the world. So yeah, we can always share a bit more of that through the systems innovation platform and the group on cities we've got there, and also on the Miro board, if anyone's had taken a look at that yet. I think, yeah. Is there any other questions? There was not that many coming through in the chat, but lots of good comments and lots of good link sharing and book sharing. But yeah, other opportunities for
Donna.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm mostly just excited and delighted by what you all are talking about. And what I love is there's the rich resources and also the acknowledgement that there's no cookie cutter. Like, there's no getting out of the need to roll up the sleeves and figure out what's making sense using those systems, lenses, et cetera. But there is a question in here around, and an opportunity, I guess, where we can learn and connect donut economics, the work that's being done with the donut. And that's one thing that came to mind. But the other thing, and I can't find anybody that's really following this work, so I'm curious, the early work of Christopher Alexander, a pattern language, and then the follow-up work by Michael Mahaffey and some others, I think I'm pronouncing his name right, which wasn't talking so much about systems thinking, but my God, there was systems thinking in all of that work. And it seems like such a rich resource that hardly got used. And then, of course, we've got all the work of Jane Alexander, the ongoing work that continues with Ellen Denham Jones. So I'm not dropping these names I'm not thoroughly knowledgeable about all this stuff, although I do have those books and I've studied them. But I'm wondering, are you guys familiar with any of these things? Have you pulled some of those threads in of those people? Because I love the whole cross-boundary, cross-collaboration richness that you're talking about.
Not me personally, but I wonder, Mariana, Noel, or David, if you guys kind of familiar with that. Or Cobus? Cobus got his hand up. Go on, Cobus. You're on mute, Cobus.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Yeah, if I can jump in, yeah. Donna, that's actually a very good point. So the interesting thing about complexity in cities is the fact that it's not new at all. So throughout the history, there was always signs of people understanding the complex undertone of cities. And those authors you mentioned are exactly the ones who captured it. I think if you look at A City Is Not a Tree by Alexander, I think that was 1965. Then Jane Jacobs. I mean, Professor Mike Batty, who's a pioneer of complex systems in cities at UCL here in London, mentioned in a talk once about about the undertone of Jane Jacobs's work and how that really relates back to the complexity of urban systems. There's a fantastic book. I was just looking it up now. It's called The Complexity Theories of Cities Have Come of Age. So I'll put the link in the chat, but it basically sums up, it's got a fantastic summary that basically goes back to all these authors. And it's a discussion, I think, between Mike Batty and Louis Bettencourt as well from the University of Chicago, where they actually take a step back and say, let's look at historical work and see where this thread of complexity in cities really came from, which is quite fascinating.
Thanks, Cobus. Yeah, please share links, and we think we need to get like a systems innovation or systems thinking reading list going. I think David Barkisov is waving, rather putting his hand up, and Ted Fowler, over to you.
Me?
Yeah, Ted, yeah.
Okay, lovely. Systems innovation. This is the first time since lockdown started that I've been able to put my hand up in a Zoom meeting. Up till now, I've been disabled. I somehow had the cheap version, but now we're all equal. So I'm from Bristol, and I find some of the talk, the analysis and the tools really, really helpful. But some of the talk about systems innovation is like, oh, we've been doing this, or we've been trying to do this, and now we've got some tools to be able to help us conceive that. So that's great. And thank you very much. It's really interesting. I'm going to follow this up very much. One of the issues that I'm concerned about is what kind of infrastructure does a city need in order to make sure that our innovation ecology keeps growing and becoming useful for people. We talk a lot of these days about innovators, and innovators is becoming a profession in itself, but in a way that's almost like a circular problem in itself then. So we need to get out of double bind and make sure, I think, that innovation is something that we all feel comfortable with, that we all feel creative with. So in a way, I'm looking for inclusive innovation, but most importantly, I recognize that the big changes have come with investment. So how do we make sure that innovation is powered to be able to be changed? And I put in a couple of comments earlier on about how localities in this country are disempowered these days from making decisions, let alone delegating them to neighbourhoods. Yeah, if there's any kind of comments about that, I am very much involved in the One City approach in Bristol. So we could talk about that separately. I'm just interested in other places, really. Sorry, David. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so any of the panelists want to jump in? I think is a super interesting question about, yeah, how do you create, an ecology for innovation, where innovation can thrive within a city context? Really interesting question. Joss is putting a few things in the chat, I can see.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about that a lot. So, the last section I touched upon there, systems building, it's really about that question. How do you take an ecosystems and an innovation approach to kind of tackling these systemic challenges that no one organization can really respond to? So I've been thinking a lot, and our hubs, right, are kind of platforms. I mean, in the long-term vision is these are platforms for fostering these kind of innovation systems, innovation ecosystems, and doing open innovation. So, and I've been part of kind of crafting the hubs and thinking about that vision and so forth. So I've done a lot of thinking of that. I put together some guides on the website there. I shared a link with you. There's a lot of dimensions to it, but it's about creating these kind of open spaces where you can bring people together, and you can have those kind of, one of the last slides I showed there, a platform, an open space that has an identity. We're coming together for this reason. We're all interested in whatever it is, figuring out how to make the water system work better in our city. We're here for that reason. Who are the different actors? How can we work together in synergistic ways? What are the activities that we're going to actually do together that are going to enable us to collaborate? What's the value model? So on and so forth. How do we get learning going? How do we know if we're going in the right direction? There's many different, they're complex systems, right? They're like gardens and so forth. That's why I love the analogy. So there's many different dimensions to it, and I'll just share, what we have so far in terms of those guides.
Noel, what's to add to that in terms of what's happening in the boroughs you've been working in London?
Yeah, so I just put in the chat, so kind of we're in the kind of the Olympic era where there's kind of massive regeneration. We identified, like in other areas, that kind of perhaps the economic benefits hadn't necessarily spilled through to local communities. So as we move into like the next stage of that, where we've got big global organisations coming to locate themselves, like V&A, like BBC, etc., as well as some high growth like startups, is actually really challenge ourselves and challenge them on like what inclusivity like means, what an inclusive innovation district means, and create some tangible commitments around that. But then be able to use kind of like the living labs approach that just talked about to actually like start testing those out. So for example, if it is around reducing the ethnicity pay gap, what are the pilots that different businesses could do to kind of test out ways to do that and work as a collaborative, but make sure that kind of we don't just say, isn't it great that we've got these big organizations coming in when kind of local people around can't access their jobs. So that there's no route one to any of this, is there? And each of those organizations have got their own systems and cultures, but it's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, thanks, Noel. I'm just looking at time, and I think it's probably a good time to wrap things up and bring them to a close. We could talk all evening or all morning, whatever the time is where you guys are. I think we wrap up. So thank you just again to everyone who's joined the call. Today it's been fascinating to sort of be on the same call and share the same space with everyone, and some great resources and links been shared through everyone on the chat. And clearly the Systems Innovation platform is another great resource of some of those guides and canvases that Joss mentioned. Have a look at the Murray board. I think there may be a few things in there. I put something about the knife crime TED talk in Glasgow. Please do connect with us, connect with each other. I think Donna made the point that we're all on here, we've all got shared interests, sort of similar mindsets, and great to have this international community of systems thinkers, systems innovators. Please feel free to add your LinkedIn and things in the chat. You can find the Systems Innovation LinkedIn group as well, which is a good way of connecting with people, as well as going through the two sort of systems innovation platforms, which I'm sure Joss will put the links to again. There'll be more events coming up, I think. So the group's very active in putting lots of events on. So I think there's usually a couple of events every week. If you're brand new to the group, we will try and do some more events around cities specifically. So with myself and Cobus and Mariana and a few others, and Noel and others who are supporting the group to put on events, we'll do some more and put some more things on and try and bring this group back together. Joss, anything else to add before we close up?
No, I think you covered everything there. It's a great session. Really enjoyed getting this off the ground. Actually, I think it's such a hot topic, isn't it? I mean, it's such a good fit between all this complexity way of thinking and cities, which are complex adaptive systems, and all the wicked kind of challenges they have, and the need for systems innovation. So it's been great to get this conversation started, and I look forward to following it up in the future.
Right.
Let's wrap up for now, and you'll find the recording on YouTube and all the links there, and we'll keep the conversation going. I'll keep you posted about future events, or we can talk more on this. Okay, guys, thank you very much for joining.
Thanks.
Bye now.